The city seemed to breathe a sigh of relief every evening. When the workers had gone home, the neon signs blinked awake, and the streets echoed with the hum of life winding down. You had always found comfort in those hours, the way routine folded into night. But one evening, the comfort was broken. The first fire wasn't grand, not at first glance. A warehouse at the edge of the industrial district where no one paid much attention. Yet you felt it, the smoke curling into the sky, black and bitter, tugging at something inside you. People gathered at the scene, muttering about accidents, faulty wiring, a careless worker. But even as they spoke, you noticed the hush in their voices, the unspoken fear that accidents didn't quite feel like this. You stood among them, watching flames lick at the metal siding, their tongues orange and hungry. Sirens wailed and fire trucks roared in, their lights painting the night red. Firefighters fought with determination, but the fire burned as though it had been waiting, as if it had been summoned. You couldn't explain why your heart raced, not from excitement, but from a shadow of dread. Something told you this wasn't the end. Days passed and life tried to smooth itself over again. People returned to their routines, but the warehouse stood charred, a skeleton of beams and twisted steel. You walked past it once, feeling the stillness, the smell of ash still clinging to the air. That's when the second fire came. This one, closer. A small grocery run by a family who had been there for decades. It happened at night, when the building was closed, when flames wouldn't find customers inside. Still, they spread fast, devouring shelves of canned goods, boxes of cereal, the history of a family business. The community came together in disbelief. Some whispered sabotage, others clung to electrical faults. But your thoughts shifted, darkly, to the idea of someone choosing this, choosing destruction, choosing fear. It didn't take long for the city to notice the rhythm. First one, then another, then another. Each fire happened at night, when streets were quiet, when fire crews had to be pulled from restless sleep. The flames began to write a message across the skyline, and though no one could read it yet, you felt the letters forming. You realized, slowly, that this wasn't chaos. This was intention. Walking the streets at night, you felt yourself looking over your shoulder, not for someone chasing, but for the glimmer of orange in the dark. You could almost hear the crackle of a match being struck. People started locking their shops earlier. Families double-checked their smoke alarms. Neighbors stood at their windows longer into the night. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The news stations covered it with grim regularity. Suspicious fire downtown. Another blaze destroys historic building. Officials investigating possible arson. You sat in front of the screen, watching reporters speak into microphones with their faces lit by firelight behind them. They tried to sound firm, to deliver facts, but beneath the words was the tremor of uncertainty. This wasn't a single tragic accident. This was something worse, something alive. You began to wonder about the person behind it. Were they in the crowds, blending in, watching their work consume the night? Were they smiling at the panic, savoring the chaos? Or were they silent, expressionless, detached from the very suffering they caused? The questions dug into you, clawing at your sleep, because if they could strike once and twice and again, then who was safe? On some nights, you could swear the city glowed differently. Street lamps seemed duller, unable to compete with the memory of flames. The horizon always felt slightly smoky, as if ash lingered in the air even when no fire burned. You felt it in your lungs, in your chest, a weight pressing down. Soon, the whispers turned to open fear. This was no coincidence, no streak of bad luck. People began calling the unknown figure by a new name, the Arsonist. It made them real, almost mythic, a shadowy figure who walked the alleys and chose buildings to feed to the fire. Children were told not to wander too far after dark. Business owners slept in their shops, some clutching baseball bats, others praying. The arsonist had not just burned buildings, they had burned safety itself. And then came the fire that shook the city to its core, a boarding house crowded with those who couldn't afford anywhere else. The flames tore through wooden walls like paper. People screamed from windows, some leaping into the night, some swallowed by the smoke. The death toll wasn't hidden this time. It screamed across headlines, across whispers at bus stops, across candle-lit vigils. You watched the city break that night. This was no longer just destruction of property, it was murder cloaked in fire. And you realized with chilling clarity that the arsonist wasn't finished. They had found their stage, and the city itself was their theater. Each flame was applause, each plume of smoke their encore. As you lay in bed, the faint smell of smoke in your imagination, you couldn't escape the thought. Someone was out there loving this, loving the chaos, and tomorrow night they might choose again. You began to trace the rhythm of the fires as if they were notes in some terrible song only the arsonist could compose. At first, the blazes felt random, warehouse, grocery, boarding house, but when you leaned closer, you started to see the deliberate hand behind them. Each site was carefully chosen, each fire growing bolder than the last. You could almost imagine the arsonist walking the streets in daylight, blending into the crowd, their eyes scanning for the next target. The investigators spoke of accelerants, of suspicious burn patterns, of flames that spread too quickly to be natural. You listened to the reports with a strange intensity, catching the words that others missed. Unusual point of origin, multiple ignition sources, signs of premeditation. Each phrase added weight to the picture forming in your mind. This wasn't a reckless vandal. This was someone who knew fire intimately, someone who understood its hunger and how to feed it. You began to think of fire the way they must think of it, not as destruction, but as language. Flames curling up a stairwell became a sentence. Smoke pushing out windows became punctuation. The more you noticed, the more unsettling it became. Because the fires weren't just attacks, they were messages, taunts left for the city to decipher. Patterns emerged not only in the flames, but in the timing. The arsonist struck late at night, between midnight and 3 a.m., when the city was at its most vulnerable. They chose nights with wind, nights when fire could leap from one structure to another, daring the firefighters to keep up. It was as if they were choreographing chaos, a dancer whose partner was destruction itself. You found yourself walking different routes home, scanning alleys for signs of accelerant cans or scorch marks. Every wisp of smoke in the distance made your pulse quicken. Sometimes it was nothing more than a restaurant vent or a neighbor's chimney. Other times, you weren't so lucky. One night, you rounded a corner and saw flames already clawing at the side of a laundromat. The air was thick with heat, the smell sharp and chemical. You didn't wait. You called it in, your voice trembling as you gave the address. Within minutes, sirens filled the night, but the building was already lost. You stood among the crowd, faces lit in orange, and you couldn't shake the thought that the arsonist might be standing there too, maybe even next to you, savoring every second. The city began to map the fires, drawing pins on large boards, string connecting locations. The clusters formed almost like constellations, points of heat that spelled out a story no one yet understood. Reporters interviewed experts, psychologists, criminologists, anyone who could explain why someone would do this. Control, one said. Power, another offered. A third leaned closer to the microphone and said what everyone feared: satisfaction. And the city noticed something even more disturbing. The fires were spreading outward, radiating from the center like ripples in water. What began as a handful of isolated incidents became a slow, deliberate expansion, as if the arsonist were marking territory, claiming more and more of the map with each blaze. You began to wonder how they chose their buildings. Did they walk by a store during the day, noting the exits, the flammable materials inside? Did they imagine the faces of the owners, the panic of the firefighters, the grief of the community? Or was it even colder than that? Just numbers, times, and calculations, detached from the human lives entangled in the fire? The fire department grew exhausted. Their faces appeared on the news, soot-streaked, their eyes heavy from sleepless nights. Yet the arsonist only grew stronger, as if fueled by the very chaos they created. Some nights, firefighters contained the flames before they spread too far, but other nights, they were too late. You overheard conversations everywhere, on buses, in diners, in whispered phone calls. People shared their theories, their suspects, their fears. It's a disgruntled firefighter. No, it's a local business rival. Maybe it's just some sick thrill seeker. Every theory only deepened the unease because the truth remained hidden. You started to keep your own notebook, scribbling down dates, locations, times. It wasn't that you thought you could solve it. You weren't an investigator. But there was something about writing it out, seeing the sequence, that made the madness feel just a little less overwhelming. Yet, as your list grew longer, you realized something chilling. The fires were accelerating. The gaps between them were shrinking. What had started as weeks apart became days, then sometimes hours. The city's fear began to bleed into anger. At town halls, residents demanded action, shouted at officials, begged for answers. Police promised they were closing in, but still the fires burned. Each blaze was like a slap in the face to authority, a reminder that someone out there was always one step ahead. And somewhere in the darkest corners of your thoughts, you felt the twisted thrill the arsonist must have felt. The power of watching an entire city bend to fear. The knowledge that one person with a box of matches could command headlines, curfews, entire battalions of firefighters. You hated yourself for even thinking it, but the shadow of their obsession brushed against you, and it unsettled you more than the flames ever could. The city had given the arsonist a name now, whispered with trembling voices and printed in bold headlines. They were no longer faceless, nameless chaos. They were the Fire Phantom. And once a monster has a name, it becomes harder to ignore. You lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, hearing phantom crackles in the silence. You knew one thing for certain: the phantom wasn't finished. The pattern was only beginning to reveal itself, and the fires yet to come would burn brighter, deadlier, and closer to the heart of the city. The city had grown used to waking up to sirens, smoke stains on the horizon, and the bitter scent of ash drifting downwind. But now, as the pattern of destruction deepened, the search for the one behind it sharpened. You could feel the tension tighten like a noose, suspicion spreading, names whispered, neighbors glaring at neighbors. The fire phantom, once just a faceless rumor, had become the invisible presence haunting every block. Detectives began to step forward on the evening news, their voices heavy with exhaustion but tinged with resolve. They explained their strategies, talked about accelerant residue, and showed grainy footage of flickering shadows near the crime scenes. Yet, even with their charts and forensic talk, their eyes betrayed them. They weren't in control. They were chasing a ghost. You started to notice how suspicion clung to certain people in the city. A loner who wandered the streets at night, always carrying a lighter. A former employee of the burned grocery store, bitter after being fired. Even a few firefighters came under scrutiny. After all, who else knew fire so intimately? Who else would benefit from endless blazes to fight? The theories spread like sparks, and with every one, you felt the paranoia deepen. At the corner diner, two men argued loudly about their theory. One swore it was a homeless man he'd seen lingering near the warehouse before it burned. The other insisted it had to be someone from the fire department. You sat silently, sipping your coffee, realizing both men looked more frightened than convinced. They wanted answers, any answers, because the truth, the absence of certainty, was unbearable. Police patrols grew thicker at night. Cruisers rolled slowly through neighborhoods, their lights flicking across shuttered shops and nervous pedestrians. But still, fires burned. It became clear that the Phantom didn't fear patrols, didn't fear cameras, didn't even fear getting caught. That brazenness only made the city more desperate. The arson squad gathered evidence, charred fragments, melted locks, residue scraped from blackened floors. They spoke of chemical signatures, of gasoline mixed with solvents, of incendiary devices cobbled together with unnerving precision. You listened closely, fascinated and horrified, realizing the Phantom wasn't improvising. They were refining. Each fire was more efficient, more devastating than the last. One night, as you walked home, you turned down an alley and caught a faint smell. Sharp, chemical, wrong. For a moment, you froze, listening for footsteps. The alley was empty, the dumpsters still, but you couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there moments before. You quickened your pace, heart pounding, glancing back again and again. That night, you barely slept. The next morning, the news broke. Another fire, only blocks away from where you'd walked. You felt your stomach drop as you realized how close you might have been, not just to the flames, but to the Phantom themselves. And the list of suspects kept growing. The police interrogated drifters, questioned ex-cons with arson records, followed tips phoned in by frightened citizens. But the Phantom stayed elusive, a step ahead, as though mocking every attempt. You wondered if they listened to the same reports you did, laughing quietly at the wrong turns, the false leads, the innocent lives temporarily ruined by suspicion. The paranoia began to split the community. Some accused the police of incompetence. Others believed a cover-up was underway. There were even those who thought the Phantom might be more than one person, a network, a group feeding off each other's obsession. You overheard a woman in the market whisper, "Maybe it's not a who, but a what," her eyes wide with superstitious terror. You almost laughed, but then you thought of the flames leaping like living creatures, and the laughter stuck in your throat. And beneath all the fear, there was another emotion festering: anger. At town meetings, voices cracked with rage. People demanded curfews, demanded harsher penalties, demanded protection. The officials promised everything they could, but the Phantom's fires spoke louder than their reassurances. Each blaze was a reminder that the city was being toyed with, played like a piano by someone who thrived on their suffering. The Phantom's boldness reached a new height with the fire at the courthouse. The building didn't collapse, but its marble facade was scarred black, its pillars streaked with soot. It was an unmistakable message. No place was untouchable, not even the heart of justice itself. You stood among the onlookers, feeling your throat tighten. The crowd muttered with fury, some shouting curses into the smoky air. And you realized chillingly that this was exactly what the Phantom wanted. Investigators, desperate, brought in profilers, men and women who stared into the fire and tried to see the mind behind it. They spoke of obsession, compulsion, trauma buried deep in the past. They painted pictures of a lonely figure, someone invisible by day but alive by night, intoxicated by fire's glow. You listened to their words, and part of you felt they were speaking directly to you, pulling you into the Phantom's world, daring you to glimpse their twisted reflection. For every suspect cleared, the Phantom grew stronger, untouchable, almost mythic. And as you lay in bed, the phantom crackle of fire creeping into your ears, you realized something grim. The Phantom wasn't hiding from the city. The Phantom was hiding within it, among the crowds, in the cafes, on the buses, maybe even brushing past you in the street. The hunt had narrowed, yes, but the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. The city wasn't just haunted by fire anymore. It was haunted by doubt. And you couldn't help but wonder if the Phantom was smiling, watching the city tear itself apart, one suspicion at a time. You began to see the story less as a sequence of burned buildings and more as a descent into a singular, twisted mind. The Fire Phantom's trail wasn't just a string of crime scenes, it was a window into obsession. And though you resisted at first, the pull of understanding grew stronger. If you could imagine what they thought, what they felt, maybe you could glimpse why the city burned. Experts on the evening news spoke of pyromania, the clinical hunger for fire. They explained it wasn't simply mischief or anger, it was compulsion. Some people lit matches the way others bit their nails or tapped their feet, except their compulsion devoured entire city blocks. You tried to picture that compulsion, the restless itch in the Phantom's chest when the night fell quiet. For them, stillness must have been unbearable. Fire was their answer, their release. And beneath that compulsion lurked something darker. Power. The Phantom had turned fire into a weapon, a stage, a way of bending the city to their will. They could light a match in the shadows, and within minutes, sirens would scream, neighbors would gather, reporters would rush, and the whole city would twist toward their creation. That power, the power to control chaos, must have tasted intoxicating. You thought of the Phantom walking through crowds of panicked onlookers, blending in, their face calm while everyone else's was contorted with fear. You wondered if they smiled inwardly, savoring the irony of being the quietest person in the crowd while holding the darkest secret. You wondered if in those moments they felt like a god. And yet, fire has a way of revealing truth. Investigators knew the Phantom's work bore the marks of ritual. The accelerant poured in the same patterns. The ignition always triggered from multiple points. Even the times of night repeated with eerie precision. These weren't random decisions, they were compulsions, habits carved into the Phantom's very bones. Psychologists speculated about the phantom's childhood, about matches stolen from a parent's drawer, about small fires lit behind garages, about the thrill of control in an otherwise powerless life. They spoke of trauma, loneliness, neglect, the perfect soil in which obsession grows. Perhaps fire had once comforted them, a flicker of light in a dark childhood, and now that flicker had become a roaring addiction. The phantom didn't just set fires, they watched. Witnesses sometimes reported a figure lingering at the edges of the crowd, silent, still, vanishing before questions could be asked. You imagined their heart pounding as they inhaled the smoke, their pupils widening as flames climbed higher. It wasn't the destruction they loved most, it was the spectacle. The fire was their theater, the city their unwilling audience. But obsession comes with cracks. The very patterns that betrayed their compulsions also betrayed their identity. Investigators circled in on those habits, noting the similarities, connecting threads. They said most arsonists couldn't stop, no matter how dangerous it became, no matter how many police patrols or cameras lined the streets. Fire was stronger than fear, stronger than reason. The phantom's own desires would eventually undo them. The phantom didn't just set fires, they watched. Witnesses sometimes reported a figure lingering at the edges of the crowd, silent, still, vanishing before questions could be asked. You imagined their heart pounding as they inhaled the smoke, their pupils widening as flames climbed higher. It wasn't the destruction they loved most, it was the spectacle. The fire was their theater, the city their unwilling audience. But obsession comes with cracks. The very patterns that betrayed their compulsions also betrayed their identity. Investigators circled in on those habits, noting the similarities, connecting threads. They said most arsonists couldn't stop, no matter how dangerous it became, no matter how many police patrols or cameras lined the streets. Fire was stronger than fear, stronger than reason. The phantom's own desires would eventually undo them. You thought of the phantom alone in their room, cleaning soot from their hands, hiding accelerant in cupboards, staring into the mirror. Did they see themselves as monstrous, or did they see only brilliance? Perhaps they felt misunderstood, even justified, that the city deserved its cleansing flames. Or perhaps they felt nothing at all, hollow except for the moment when fire filled them up. And somewhere, uncomfortably, you felt the edges of recognition. You remembered moments when you'd stared into a campfire, mesmerized, unable to look away. Times when you lit a candle and found your eyes lingering too long on the flame. That fascination, the draw toward heat and light, lives in all of us. For the phantom, it was just magnified, warped, unrestrained. The difference was scale, not kind. That realization unsettled you, made you shiver in your own skin. As investigators pieced together profiles, you noticed how the phantom escalated. They no longer chose empty warehouses or closed stores. Their fires licked at homes, apartments, places where people slept. That shift revealed something darker, not just obsession, but malice. It wasn't enough to watch buildings burn. Now they wanted to hear the panic, the screams, the raw human cost. Their compulsion had evolved into cruelty. And still, they weren't caught. You pictured them reading the newspapers, clipping stories, savoring their own notoriety. Perhaps they kept trophies, bits of charred wood, scorched metal, photographs of ruins. Perhaps they replayed each blaze in their mind before bed, smiling as they drifted into dreams of more. You understood now. The phantom wasn't a ghost. They were flesh and blood, bound by the same streets you walked, the same air you breathed. But their mind was fire's mirror, reflecting only hunger and heat. And the city was trapped inside their obsession, a playground of tinder waiting for the next match. As you lay awake, listening to the silence of your room, you wondered if even now, as you thought of them, they were out there preparing. The thought pressed against your chest like smoke, heavy and suffocating, because fire doesn't sleep, and neither, it seemed, did the phantom. The city could not endure forever under siege. The flames had carved scars into neighborhoods, toppled businesses, and stolen lives. Yet in the midst of fear, something shifted. The fire that consumed the courthouse had ignited not only wood and stone, but determination. Investigators and citizens alike grew restless with the endless cycle of smoke and sirens. They wanted the fire phantom caught, and finally, cracks began to show. You noticed it first in the way the authorities spoke. Their words were sharper, their tone edged with a quiet certainty. They hinted at progress, at patterns finally paying off. Surveillance cameras had been increased, plainclothes officers stationed in vulnerable districts, chemical traces analyzed with precision. The phantom's rituals, once their strength, had become their weakness. Every accelerant, every timing choice, every angle of attack painted a clearer portrait. And then came the night when the phantom overreached. It began with a blaze at an abandoned schoolhouse, a grand display of fire climbing through shattered windows, smoke billowing into the midnight sky. The firefighters fought bravely, but the phantom wasn't content with just one. Hours later, another blaze erupted across the city, stretching resources thin, forcing first responders to scatter. But that very greed became their undoing. Witnesses reported seeing a lone figure near the school before the fire erupted, a shadow moving with purpose, carrying something metallic. Others claimed to see the same figure near the second blaze, though the timeline seemed impossible. Still, the tips aligned closely enough to narrow the search. For the first time, the phantom's shadow had weight. Police traced chemical purchases, reviewing logs from hardware stores and suppliers. One name began to stand out, a man whose late-night wanderings matched the timelines, whose background revealed a fascination with fire stretching back years. Neighbors recalled odd smells wafting from his garage, the constant flicker of light behind drawn curtains. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man hiding in plain sight. You pictured the arrest as it unfolded, plainclothes officers trailing him through darkened streets, the phantom pausing in an alley, unaware eyes were on him, his hands itching to light another blaze. And then, suddenly, the silence breaking, shouts, footsteps, the weight of bodies bringing him down. A box of matches clattered to the pavement, and for the first time, the city exhaled. The trial came swiftly, each day revealing fragments of the phantom's life, childhood fires in empty lots, petty crimes overlooked, a growing obsession fed by loneliness, by anger, by the twisted comfort of flames. Psychologists debated whether he was sick or evil, broken or calculating, but the families who sat in the courtroom cared little for labels. They only knew the cost, their homes gone, their loved ones lost, their city scarred. You watched the proceedings unfold in newspapers, on television, in whispered retellings at diners. The phantom, once mythic, now sat small and flesh-bound in a courtroom chair. No flame surrounded him, no smoke cloaked him. Without fire, he seemed diminished, ordinary, even pathetic. And yet, the danger of his mind lingered in the way he stared at nothing, the way his lips twitched, as if recalling some private spectacle. When the verdict came, guilty on every count, the city erupted not in fire, but in relief. For the first time in months, nights felt dark instead of orange. Children slept without fear. Shopkeepers left their businesses without dread. The silence of an untouched skyline became its own kind of miracle. Yet even in victory, scars remained. Charred beams jutted from lots where homes once stood. Families rebuilt slowly, haunted by memories of smoke curling through their dreams. Firefighters carried the exhaustion in their bones, their lungs heavy from nights spent in smoke. And you carried it too, that lingering image of flames, that sense of how fragile safety really is. Because you understood now that fire doesn't only burn wood or stone, it burns trust, it burns peace. And though the phantom was gone, their legacy lived in the ash-streaked corners of the city, in the way people still paused when they smelled smoke, in the way silence at night felt too still, too fragile. And as you lay in bed, hearing the hum of the city around you, you realized something unsettling. The phantom had been caught, yes, but somewhere, in some other city, someone else might be staring into the glow of a match, feeling the same hunger, the same pull. Fire has a way of calling to those who listen. The city had survived, but the memory of its terror would never fully fade, and neither would your awareness of how thin the line is between ordinary nights and nights lit by fire. Now, as the story settles in your thoughts, allow yourself to let go of the crackle and roar of those flames. The phantom's fires were real, their terror undeniable, but the city endured, and you can too. Imagine the skyline not lit with orange, but bathed in the calm glow of street lamps. Picture firefighters resting at home, their helmets set aside, their lungs filled with clean night air. Picture families returning to rebuilt homes, their laughter rising above the silence that once felt heavy with dread. And as you lay in bed, hearing the hum of the city around you, you realized something unsettling. The phantom had been caught, yes, but somewhere, in some other city, someone else might be staring into the glow of a match, feeling the same hunger, the same pull. Fire has a way of calling to those who listen. The city had survived, but the memory of its terror would never fully fade, and neither would your awareness of how thin the line is between ordinary nights and nights lit by fire. Now, as the story settles in your thoughts, allow yourself to let go of the crackle and roar of those flames. The phantom's fires were real, their terror undeniable, but the city endured, and you can too. Imagine the skyline not lit with orange, but bathed in the calm glow of street lamps. Picture firefighters resting at home, their helmets set aside, their lungs filled with clean night air. Picture families returning to rebuilt homes, their laughter rising above the silence that once felt heavy with dread. You've walked through fear tonight, through smoke, suspicion, and obsession. You've glimpsed the mind of someone who tried to bend an entire city to their will, and you've seen how fragile safety can be. But you've also seen resilience. For every blaze the phantom set, there were firefighters who fought back. For every night of fear, there were neighbors who stood together. And for every scar left behind, there was rebuilding, slow and steady, stronger than before. As your eyes grow heavy, let the weight of the story drift from you. Leave the fire behind. Let the silence wrap around you like a blanket, safe and unbroken. The phantom belongs to the past, to the shadows of memory, not to your dreams. Breathe deeply, steady and calm. Feel the darkness of your room, cool and gentle, untouched by flame. You've wandered through the ash and the smoke, and now it's time to rest in the quiet. The story has ended, the fire has burned out, and only peace remains. Sleep well. The night is yours again.